Welcome to Racial and Social Justice Beyond the Dome. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Dan Yu, and here with Lily Crawford, who joins from the board of the Notre Dame Club of Pittsburgh. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Maria McKenna, Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Africana Studies, Senior Associate Director of the Education, Schooling, and Society Undergraduate Minor, and Institute of Educational Initiatives Fellow, and a faculty member for the ACE Teaching Fellows. And I believe you're also the recipient of the 2015 Reverend Edmund P. Joyce Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching and the 2017 Reinhold Niebuhr Award for Social Justice. So welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure to have you on our show this evening. For the audience, we've got a lot to talk about for what she's doing outside of the Africana Studies. But first, what I'd love to do is really just kind of understand, what was your origin story? Where did you come from? And tell us a little about your family.
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad that you're joining us and look forward to more conversations with any of you anytime. So when Dan and I started talking about this, one of the things that is one of the first questions people ask is, how'd you get to Africana Studies? Where did that come from? And the truth is that if you would have asked me while I was an undergraduate, what's Africana Studies, I wouldn't have been able to tell you. But I grew up in St. Joe, Michigan, just north of Notre Dame for the bulk of my early childhood. And then my family moved to Toronto, Canada, to Torino, Italy, and I came back to Notre Dame as an undergraduate from Europe. But in the span of my adolescence, we adopted a young child from Recife, Brazil. And she was, for all intents and purposes in the United States, Black. She's Brazilian, she's indigenous Brazilian. She's lovely and beautiful. She's my youngest sister. I'm the oldest of 4 girls. And I started down the path that I think I'm on even still today, in large part because of her coming to our family. She came to us at 1 year old and was, they named her birthday the day that the adoption went through in Brazil, and came home with this sweet little 1 year old human. And we promptly were transferred to Canada for my parents' work. In the meantime, the state of Michigan actually denied my parents' adoption request, because at the time in 1986, they did not allow biracial adoptions. So they worked with our congressperson at the time, and they worked with the state of Michigan to work on the adoption, which got fixed in due time. But in the meantime, we moved to Canada and crossed the border, and we crossed the border with an infant who wasn't a naturalized citizen, and you cannot reside outside of the United States with a green card. And so I watched my parents juggle immigration. I watched my mom have my sister's green card taken away one night at the border. And I started to piece together all kinds of questions about equity, about inclusion, about immigration, about colorism, about race and identity that have sort of stuck with me all the way through. So we moved to Canada in spite of the green card being taken. And while I was there, I was part of a country that was in some ways a generation behind the United States in terms of their immigration story. So I had a lot of young people who were my friends whose parents were first generation immigrants to Canada. And watched what that first generation versus second generation immigration story was and looked like and felt like. And then when I was a junior in high school, we moved to Turin, Italy. And when I was in Turin, we had a really different experience. I went to a very expensive private American high school. And I went with, frankly, a lot of really rich Italian students. And as I was there, um, I was very clearly introduced to wealth disparities that colored a lot of what I went on to study. I came back to Notre Dame as a first-year student with my family still in Europe. I counted, for all of you who are looking at my lily white skin, I counted as one of Notre Dame's diversity statistics in 1993. Because even if you were American, if you were an expatriated American coming to the university from a foreign country, you counted as an international student, which counted in the diversity numbers for Notre Dame. So we've come a long way since then. Wow is right. I tell that story now and people look at me and are like, really? But that is a true statement. And I came to Notre Dame and ended up studying economics and theater. Economics because I thought I was being practical, and theater because that was what I loved at the time. And the truth is both of those have stayed with me in different ways to send me on a path to thinking about and studying equity, race, privilege, power, all of the things that make the headlines today and have for many, many years.
So you really were a firsthand witness to not just the technicalities in the immigration process, which can complicate things.
Mm-hmm.
You were, I mean, really deep in because it was your sibling emotionally, right? And dealing with the ups and downs, right? That can come from all of these crazy happenings. Then.
Yeah, and the honest truth is, I was looking at this through a lens of enormous privilege, right? We were all English speaking. My sister was really young and oblivious to what was going on for the most part. My parents had lots of connections and legal connections that they could use to make those things better. But in the end, I spent the better part of the next 2 decades watching my little sister struggle through things both here and abroad that I didn't have to struggle through because of the color of her skin and the color of my skin.
And so when you then came back to the States,
Mm-hmm.
you then came back to Notre Dame and your family came too?
They didn't. I came on my own, and in some ways I was coming home. I had not lived in the States since I was 12, and I came somewhere familiar. I knew Notre Dame because of my family, because frankly, South Bend was the big mall. That's where we came to shop when I was a kid. Anybody who's from any kind of metropolis thinks that's hilarious. But I came to Notre Dame because it was comfortable and it was a place that I knew. And I'm keenly aware of, in the roles that I take on now, how not true that is for so many of our students, and the privilege that I came with, knowing even where La Fortune was, or knowing what a game day looked like for football, or knowing where the post office was, or how to use the dining hall.
Right. And so you then left Notre Dame and you've come back in the Africana Studies program. I guess, could you tell the audience a little bit about some of the work
Sure.
you're doing within the program? And I believe one of the things you've been working on is the marginalization in U.S. schools.
Right. And what I will say is, so my husband and I are a team, so we came back together. And he was actually hired first. I went on after Notre Dame to graduate school to study education, and had 4 kids and had a life in the classroom with young kids, and then decided to get a PhD to really study and think about educational equity. And I actually credit the economics department at Notre Dame for helping me figure out that that's where I wanted to be. I had some really influential female faculty members who really guided me through an economics program that wasn't so much an econometrics degree as it was a poverty studies deep dive, and really thinking about how do we think about monetary and fiscal policy related to poverty? How do we think about markets? How do we think about alternative non-neoclassical models of economics that might be more progressive or inclusive. And all of those things led me to start to study schools and to study how inequitable schools were in all kinds of ways, everything from literal facilities to thinking about who has access to really great teachers, who has access to English language instruction if they need it, and frankly, who has access to the kinds of spaces in the US that we all often take for granted for those of us who went to high quality public schools or even were part of the Catholic school system or the private school system in the US. So I came to Africana Studies quite accidentally. I started working for them while I was still finishing my PhD. And as I finished, I said, okay, now I need to go find a real job. And they said, please don't go. And I said, well, hire me. They said, well, we don't really have a job. And I said, okay, then I have to find a real job. And eventually we came through some conversations, and they brought me on as the director of undergraduate studies, but also I teach for them in exactly the areas that you were just talking about, Dan, educational equity, marginalization, historic marginalization of different populations, and actually courses on youth empowerment and asset-based thinking around kids, families, and schooling in the US in particular.
That's great. So we had a guest on a few weeks ago, a gentleman named Sonny Hereford, who was the first Black student, or well, amongst the first 4 Black students to attend an integrated school in the state of Alabama. And seeing the pictures of him being walked by his father to the school and him describing what it was like in the 60s to attend a school where he was the only Black student there. So the 4 students went to different schools, and hearing those stories was really jarring. But coming from an academic perspective, could you, I guess, detail some of the things that would be jarring for students or for this audience?
Sure. So I'll start with the idea, the fact that schools are more racially segregated, racial and ethnically segregated now than they ever have been in the history of the US since Brown versus Board of Education was enacted. Indigenous Americans have some of the highest rates of challenges with depression, suicide, alcoholism, and other factors that influence mental health. We often forget that they're a population that we can even have conversations around and work with in communities. I would tell you that in the past 30 years in particular, but even before that, we have seen fewer and fewer states really bolstering and buoying their public education systems than ever. And in place of that, we're seeing a trend towards the privatization of a public good of schooling in the US. That's one of the most challenging pieces of the conversation around education today is if we're going to have charter schools, how do we, if we're going to have vouchers, if we're going to have tax scholarship credits, how are we also going to support the 50 million children in the United States that still use traditional public schools? And our public school population is majority minority now, is the way the government would say it. But there are more people of color in the United States in American public schools at this point than ever before, and they outnumber those of us who identify as white or European American by origin. I can keep going, but I don't want to overwhelm people.
No, well, I think it definitely speaks to just some of the greater macro funding issues, right? So that, how does one school get more support than another one, right? That may be right next to each other, right? And so in urban settings, that's pretty stark, right? Because they can be very close to each other, and it's it's the whole idea of redlining, right?
Sure.
And how that that creates instant deserts for transportation or education or food or healthcare. But that's but education obviously is I think one of the things that I think speaks to all of us here, right? I mean, we're Notre Dame, and we think we do think pretty broadly, with especially being a force for good. So, but in South Bend, that has to be pretty stark too, right? Just even
Absolutely. So you might be surprised to know that South Bend is still under a mandatory desegregation order. The desegregation order didn't come into play until 1981. And for a frame of reference, I was in first grade when the mandatory desegregation order came in to play in South Bend. I didn't go to school here, but for me, that's a pretty poignant thing to think that Brown versus the Board of Education is 20 years before I'm born. And I'm in first grade when South Bend really has to deal with some racial reckoning about integration. And we live in a city that in some ways is thriving and is working really hard to change the narrative that many of us heard when we came here, which is South Bend's dying, there's nothing here for young people. In fact, our schools are working really, really hard to be innovative and thoughtful. There's lots of really great work going on, but we still are a district that is serving a population where 70% of our children are on free and reduced lunch, which means that they are either at or below the poverty line or just above it as a family.
Could you repeat that? 70%?
70%. And we've been in the news a couple of times this fall because we've been working really hard as a district to make sure when our children were online in the spring and then into the beginning of the school year because of COVID, that we had both access to high quality, high speed internet for all of our kiddos, but also opportunities to go to care centers for children whose families couldn't stop working and weren't able to be at home because they're 6 and they're supposed to do online school. So there's some pretty amazing work and some pretty amazing people in the city of South Bend and in the South Bend School Corporation, but the challenges are deep. The disparities in punishment, in suspension, in expulsion in South Bend between different racial and ethnic groups are appalling. Our teaching cadre does not reflect our student population, either in terms of gender or racial or ethnic diversity, or even LGBTQ identifications. So we have work to do in lots of places, but South Bend is a wonderful place to be and think about schools and think about how do you empower communities to do right by the next generation. I spent the entire fall talking with my students and with anybody who would listen really about the power of the local. Filling out your census is an act of civic engagement. Making sure that everyone is counted and that people who might not understand what the census does in terms of funding, in terms of districting, in terms of local schools, is an act of civic engagement. Thinking about local politics and making sure you don't just vote when it's a presidential election, but when it's a school board election and a county commissioner's election, and when you're thinking about judge retention or appointees to different city commissions. So I'm just talking at this point because I could go on and on about schools and learning and how they relate to racial justice.
Yeah, it's incredible the disparities, right? And I read a news story today because New York City is going under lockdown again, and it's November, and there are still 60,000 children in the city of New York that don't have the right hardware to perform an educational endeavor. They are scrambling to print out right on paper workbooks for all of these 60,000 children, and so then how do you distribute them, right? I mean, there's the whole logistics end of it, and so it's pretty incredible. So all right, we'll move away from education for just a second. So you're not only a professor in Africana Studies, but so many other things. And I think one of the biggest stories of the year has been COVID, right? And the reopening, and you are on the faculty COVID reopening committee. Is that what it's called?
It is called the Faculty Reopening Committee, yes, but there are a lot of committees. So it's one of many committees related to COVID for sure.
And so, you're reviewing the impact, right, of reopening versus going fully online still, right? And the impact on different groups on campus, right? And so I guess to describe, what did you learn and how were you involved there?
Yeah, so our work on the Faculty Reopening Committee is really around making sure that there is open and ample communication between faculty, staff, students, and administrators so that we can troubleshoot and know where the hotspots are, not in terms of COVID, but in terms of what are students needing, what are faculty needing, what is our community needing for us as we're going through this. We have been, depending on who you ask, we have done an outstanding job or we have done a terrible job. And the truth always falls somewhere in the middle, right? We have a lot of students who are leaving campus having gotten COVID. And there are folks who say we should have been testing more frequently, we should have been testing with pooled sampling earlier. And the truth is, we are using the capacity we have to the best of our ability. We think that capacity will be different in the spring, and we're looking forward to making sure that we can minimize the number of students who become infected and to catch the asymptomatic spread of COVID. But we also really thought long and hard about, from the moment we were on the committee, and some people have been on the committee since last spring. I joined by election in late summer. But one of the things that we've had to think really hard about is what's the alternative, and what would we have been giving up for our students, particularly some of our students who are from more vulnerable households or who have fewer resources to do the high quality work, the intense work that Notre Dame requires of students. And so that's been a particular focus of mine. I'm the co-director of the Ann Bryce Scholars Program with Dr. Richard Pierce, who some of you know is a beloved professor here. And it's been really clear to us, this is a program for first generation students who come to Notre Dame with some significant leadership and significant challenges in terms of their background. And so we watched firsthand how to figure out what students needed and why we wanted to bring kids back. And I was in the camp that our students needed to be back, and our students needed to be back for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is the value of being in community, particularly for some of our most vulnerable students in a moment like we're in COVID.
Right. And so we both have children who are students.
We do.
They're both sophomores, and it's difficult for everybody, but the challenges of being on a campus with little or no social interaction, that's got to be amplified, right? For the children who are coming from a different country, right? Or who may not have the resources, right, that are available to them.
Right. And Notre Dame, for a long time, we've been talking about diversifying Notre Dame. We've been talking about diversifying in lots of different ways, racially, ethnically, economically. We're pretty good at the gender thing. We got a 50-50 balance mostly. And one of the things that we've recognized more recently, I think, is that you can't just think about the numbers of students you're admitting in any given category or the makeup of a class and stop there. You have to really think about what does it mean to bring people from lots of different backgrounds from all over the globe, from lots of different scenarios in their home worlds onto a campus and have it feel like home and have it feel like a space where you don't just persist or exist, but that you flourish and thrive. And that has never been more important than in the last 9 months. And thinking about everything from how do you connect with students when they're at home? How do you use the technology that Notre Dame has been so amazing at standing up in the last 9 months to get online, to use all kinds of programming, so that we could teach virtually more effectively. But also, how do you make sure that you're meeting the social and emotional and psychological well-being and needs of children and young people from so many different backgrounds? And we're working really hard on it. We're not perfect. We haven't done it right all the time, but we have done some pretty innovative things over this fall in particular that I'm really proud of, and I'm proud of the way that we're serving students.
So it's almost break, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
As
these
in, like, we're counting the hours at this point. Noon on Saturday, the dorms close.
Really? Are you counting?
Really?
Because I couldn't tell.
No, the truth is, it was a gift to have students back. And if I talk about that too long, I will get teary-eyed, because having to send people home, I was in Europe with students who had never traveled abroad, who had just gotten passports for the first times in their life. And as part of our scholars program, we have a global immersion experience. And I had to be the one, along with Dr. Pierce, who looked at everybody in the eye and said, I know you're having a wonderful time, and I'm so glad we got to Europe, but we have to go home, and we have to go home now, to bring kids home early.
That was in March during spring break.
It was in March during spring break, and I landed. They had been in Europe since about Friday. I landed on a Tuesday morning of that week, and at about 5 a.m. And by noon on Tuesday, we were on the phone with Anthony Travel making plans to come home.
Unbelievable. Wow.
But packing up, all of this to say, sending students off in March and reading the tea leaves and knowing that this might not be a couple-minute break, this might not be a 3-week break, but that the likelihood is, I wasn't going to see them for the rest of that semester, and couldn't have even imagined not seeing them this semester. It was pretty gut-wrenching. Yeah. Notre Dame is a place, as all of you well know, that, again, isn't perfect, but there is something special in the water. Just last night, I had a conversation with a student who, at the end of our conversation about grading and contracts for class, said, can I talk to you about another student? And mentioned the student was having trouble and was in the School of Engineering. And I said, great, I'm going to get on the phone with a colleague from the College of Engineering, which I did about 5 minutes later. And within an hour, we had 3 people working to triage this young person who needed help, and needed help right then. And that doesn't happen everywhere.
Right. Well, Notre Dame is a truly special place. And but so break's coming up. What's going to happen to these kids that are going to get sent home to, right? I mean, it could be California, but it could be a different country. What's going to happen to the ones that are, kind of in your purview then?
Yeah, so some of our more vulnerable students, we have lots of layers of scaffolding and support. There are a small number of students who will remain in South Bend and in housing that the university is working to provide them. This is a long enough break that in the summers, those students often have summer jobs where they work on campus, or they're research assistants, and so they're staying here and living in a sublet. Those things look really different. We've never had a 10-week break at Christmas before. So I've told a lot of families and a lot of parents, we are building the plane as we are flying it. And we're really trying to figure it out on the fly. So we have everything from students who are staying here and who are being supported by faculty who and staff who will check in with them and continue to be in contact with them the whole time they're here. We have lots of layers of support of staff members and different units on campus who are doing virtual programming for this entire 10 weeks. We have built up an entire body of curriculum, both courses for credit and also internships and research apprenticeships, and explorative spaces for students who aren't sure what they want to do someday, or are just thinking about different career paths. For particularly the month of January, we're making sure that anybody who wants to do something, who wants to put something unique down as having used this time wisely. But we also have introduced an entirely new online health platform, where students, no matter where they are in the world, can access a medical doctor or a therapist with the click of a button and filling out a quick form. We are working on making sure that our university health services and our counseling services are available, our campus counseling services are available to people while they're gone. We've made sure that we have fitness classes online and have a subscription to other fitness portals that students can go to. And department by department and unit by unit, we are making sure we have class meetings and game nights virtually. And I've played more random virtual games than I ever knew existed. But some of that is since COVID started, but some of that is just to see a student's face and know that they're doing okay. To know that they had what they needed that day in their house. We bought a lot of kids' desks over the last 9 months, a lot of folding TV tray tables so that people had places to work. Notre Dame has made sure that anyone who needs help with internet has gotten help with internet. So from the very practical all the way to the most nuanced, we're making sure as best we can that we're serving students whether they're here or they're at home.
That's wonderful. So by the way, the Notre Dame Club of Pittsburgh, actually, we've had virtual trivia nights. And actually Lily, who's running technical, she's one of the champions of that. And so I'll be sure to introduce you guys.
Loop me in. Yeah, I'm all about the online games.
So, all right. Well, now the people that you're serving with the Ambright Scholars Program, where are they from typically, or is that everywhere?
It's everywhere. It's students look just like the students from across the university, and our scholars programs are there are a lot of them. Ambright is just one of many. Some of them come with the association with financial need. Some of them do not. But we have an umbrella program called the Office of Student Enrichment that was started just a few years ago with a very generous benefaction to make sure that every student at Notre Dame has the same opportunities at the same experiences, regardless of their financial wherewithal or a background that might not have exposed them to opportunities like the ones that Notre Dame provides. So we want to make sure through the Office of Student Enrichment that if you need professional clothing to go to an interview, that you've got it. If you need winter hats and coats and boots because you are not from here and didn't understand what we meant when we said winter coat, that you have it. That if you needed football tickets or club dues or help with study abroad funding, that we can make sure that you have what you need. So we work in conjunction with the admissions office and financial aid office and other scholars programs around the Notre Dame landscape to make sure that we're identifying first generation students from varied backgrounds that might need a little bit of extra assistance to make sure that their experience at Notre Dame is one that is as holistic as possible.
And so the OSE, is that the same as the Office of the Fighting Irish Initiative?
It is. So Office of Student Enrichment is what we call it. It's also known as the Fighting Irish Initiative. And it's a program that has its own office and its own staff and works with students on just about anything that you can imagine. They've been instrumental in making sure that anyone who needed housing for the winter was taken care of, those kinds of things.
Gotcha. Excellent. So in 2015, you were part of the last lecture series.
I was.
And a couple of quotes that I picked up. The world we live in tells us we have to look put together. And the faster we come to realize that things are messy, the sooner we will be happy. What did you mean by those two quotes?
Yeah, so I think that probably came from an Observer article about this last lecture, maybe. And I absolutely said that, and I stand by it. I was a little taken aback because I didn't know the Observer was there, and they were going to publish this article, and there were some pretty intimate things about what I had said in this lecture that I was like, oh wow, like this is on the front page of the Observer forevermore. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, and it's totally okay that it's on the front page of the Observer, and hopefully people are going to read it someday. And if there is one thing that life has taught me, that is that it's messy. And Notre Dame is a place where I think any of us who went there and those who go there now often thought, as they looked around, like, am I the only one that doesn't really know what I'm doing? Or am I the only one that feels like I'm not supposed to be here, or I'm not smart enough, or I'm not good enough, or I'm not multifaceted enough, or fill in the blank? And lo and behold, I left Notre Dame and I still felt like that in the world. I'm like, everybody else looks like they have a job and they put makeup on every day. And what's like, how am I not seeing this? And it took me a really long time to realize that we got to be gentle with ourselves, and we've got to make sure that we can recognize that the world isn't a competition space, that we can be who we are, and we can falter and fall and have things fall apart, and we can pick ourselves back up. And the sooner people recognize that, the easier it is to be who you're meant to be in the world.
Yeah, change is the only constant. And
True.
how you react and how do you pick yourself up, right, as you say. It's okay, right? It's okay to and actually there's a fun quote from the championship boxer Mike Tyson: everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And
Right.
that's okay, right?
Best laid plans of mice and men. But here's the other thing about that, is that there's opportunity there, right? When you recognize that things aren't neat as you thought, that history isn't as a linear timeline as we were taught, there's space to learn and to grow. And there's never been a moment in my lifetime that I've realized the power of that. We're living in a world where the racial reckoning in our country has come back around in new ways. Not that it hasn't been here for the entirety of our existence, but that there's new energy and there's new synergy around that. And that's an opportunity, right? I can spend all the time that I want reminding people that I didn't know what Africana Studies was when I was 20, and that I hadn't read James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, and I didn't understand redlining, and that I didn't really have a sense of what systemic inequity was until I got deeper into things. Or I can say I have work to do, and I have more work to do, and I have work to do in these spaces. And that's a gift. That's an opportunity that we have. And whether we're talking about race and racism in this country, or we're talking about partisanship and politics, or we're talking about media and data and the way that we consume information, there's a lot of opportunity out there to admit we're not perfect, admit that we don't have all the answers, and to get to work and get our hands dirty doing it.
Yeah. So we had Reggie Brooks on a couple months ago, and he's from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. I did not know what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma up until maybe a couple years ago. I did not know what Juneteenth was up until about a year ago. And it's just not taught. And so I think the ignorance, right, for lack of a better term, the ignorance of just not knowing what is the history, because it was never taught. I think that's an obstacle that we can overcome, right? And you're the shining example of that, right? You didn't know, and now you're in the Africana Studies program. Those who choose to continue to be ignorant, they make the purposeful, intentional choice. That's harder to get over, right? And so to get past that, But I want to thank you for joining us this evening. I mean, you are a force for good. Really, it's really impressive the things that you're doing to help all of Notre Dame as a community, be thriving. You are what makes Notre Dame a special place, what makes it different. Right? There's a whole bunch of people who are working hard to make it a better place.
Whole bunch of people.
I'd like to open up the Q&A to our audience, and please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the window. Open up the Q&A window and type in your question and hit send, and we will pose the questions to Dr. McKenna. Look at that, we've got one already. Oh, Victoria Peroni. She says, thank you so much. Wonderful to hear your story. Former South Bend resident as well.
I mean, the truth is everybody has a story, right? And the sooner that we recognize that is the sooner we recognize the humanity of everybody around us. So stories are important, 100%.
And actually she lived in Italy. So, so in the Africana Studies program, I guess, what would a student expect, right, in the Africana Studies program? What's the benefit for a student who may want to pursue a degree there?
Yeah, so a long time ago, I was at an admissions event as the director of undergraduate studies, and I heard one of my colleagues say, and when your student comes home and says that they think they want to study music or they want to study theology, instead of saying, what are you going to do with that degree? You say, I can't wait to see what you do with that degree. And that was a really pivotal moment for me. It was early in my career, and it's a really important thing to remember that the truth is the study anything, do everything mantra of arts and letters is real, right? That you can study any discipline or any field at Notre Dame and go on to do a whole bunch of disparate things. We have students who come into Africana Studies and leave and do med school, law school, teaching, business, finance, entrepreneurship, pretty much you name it. And the value of ethnic studies programs writ large, but Africana Studies, the Asian American Studies program, are fledgling, but hanging on and working towards a larger program in Indigenous education, our Latino Studies, Institute for Latino Studies. All of these programs center humanity and center common humanity with an asset-based lens to looking at history and contemporary circumstances for people from marginalized backgrounds. And that's what you get when you decide you're going to minor in Africana Studies or you're going to study in these spaces, is you get a worldview and a narrative that isn't just a deficit-laden narrative that you might hear in a history book or that you get in passing in a moment in time. It's a moment where you celebrate the gifts and the culture and the history and the possibility that these particular ethnic and racial groups bring to not just your community or the country, but the world.
So we have a question from the audience. Actually, it's not really a question, but Maria's point that it's never too late to figure out who we're meant to be or do reminds me of one of my favorite ND professors' quotes, John Duffy. When he heard that one of us had not yet read an important / notable book, would say, how lucky you are to have that to look forward to. So that's a great way to look towards something.
That's exactly right. And it's right along the lines of, I can't wait to see what you do with that. I just finished 45 one-on-one meetings with my students. I graded by contract this fall. They wrote me a contract and they did all of their work, and we met one-on-one at the end of the semester to see how they did with their contract. And the contracts were widely varied in what students wanted to get out of the courses that I was teaching. And every time I would ask students about, talk to me about the reading you completed in this class. And we've all been there, and There were classes where you skimmed before you went and that was about it, or classes you read cover to cover. And the students were really honest with me. And so when they said, I'll be honest, I didn't read X book, or I'll be honest, I didn't get to this part of the syllabus, I would say, I'm so glad you have that to look forward to this winter. And it is absolutely because I stole it from John Duffy. So
That's so funny.
it's a great reminder. Jason just asked about a college board class and would I be supportive of a systemic racism class from the College Board in an AP credit. So actually the College Board has a course that is a research seminar that they've recently created about 2 years ago. And Ernest Morel, who's one of our faculty members in English and the Institute for Educational Initiatives and Africana Studies, is a literacy expert. And he worked with them on this course, this AP research seminar, but it's focused on the African diaspora. It's focused on the world of the Africana studies sort of writ large. And that is already out there and happening. There is a course in development right now that they are trying to figure out what it's named, what it's called, what it looks like, but would address systemic inequity, particularly around racial identification. And they're working on whether or not that's a sociology course or a Black history course, if it's focused just on the United States, or it's a globally minded course. But people are thinking about this, and there's real work going on. I just had a meeting with people from the College Board actually last week on this exact question. So it's a great question.
Thank you, Jason. Your teammate, Monica Wagner. Thank you, Marie. It's more of a suggestion than a question. It would be great to get you connected with Jerome Bettis, her class here. He's doing some amazing work in Philadelphia with the Bus Stops Here Foundation, and he may be able to provide some additional feedback on the Africana Studies program at Notre Dame. Thank you, Monica. Tom Kennedy, regarding the South Bend students who are learning remotely, how is the effectiveness of education being determined, especially in challenged communities? Is there plan to supplement what was lost when quote unquote normal school resumes?
Yeah, so this is a $1 million question, not just in South Bend, but all over the country, all over the world, really. And some of the places we're seeing the biggest losses that we can quantify at the moment are in developing spaces around the world where we're losing children to in-person school and we're not getting them back. So places where basic literacy is the goal of primary education, and children aren't in school right now, and it's very difficult to get them there, particularly girls. We're seeing globally, this is going to be a decade-long project to recover from, at the least. Within the United States, we are sadly seeing the gaps in terms of achievement as measured by achievement standards or achievement tests grow during this pandemic. There's no question. Children who have parents and families and caregivers who can work with them, who can help them get online, who can help them complete online assignments, who can supplement what is going on with schools with enrichment activities, are really continuing to move ahead, while some children are just keeping their head above water. So in many instances, our goal, while our stated goal is that we're still moving every child ahead, in many instances, the goal is just to not have them lose where they are. And so anything that any of you all can do to support your local school systems, whether it be online tutoring programs or read alouds, or uploading your favorite children's book as a read aloud to YouTube for parents to Google the title of a book and have somebody read it to them on the screen. Anyone who's working with education foundations where there is targeted outreach in your communities, please pay attention to them, because the learning loss is going to be real, and it's going to be significant for a while. But what I would also say is that the thing that I am most attentive to is that we are losing really valuable emotional and social connections of children. We are going to have an entire generation of young people who have been taught we don't hug, we don't touch, we don't shake hands, we don't provide physical contact with one another. And that's a huge loss. So how we help children through this pandemic emotionally and socially, how we make sure that we are way less worried about their multiplication tables than we are about whether or not they are feeling so down that they're having suicidal thoughts, is way more important in my book. And we know that COVID is disproportionately impacting communities of color, young and old. And we know that the impact isn't just a medical, physical impact, but it's also an economic one. So wherever you are, whatever your gift is, figure out how to offer it to the world right now, because we're going to need all the help we can get to take care of children and families for the next few years to recover from this.
Wow, that's a lot of heady stuff, but it's the change that has happened to us as a planet, and how we then react, right? Because everyone's got a plan, and we're off that plan. Marilee Williams, she wants to thank you for your thoughts, and she shares that it's not my job to be, it's not my child's job to be the person I dreamt that she would become. It is my job to help her be the person she dreams of becoming. And that's really echoing what you just said, right? That it does take a village, right? And it's not just maybe in many instances, it's not the parent's job solely, because they may be working two jobs, or they may have other issues that prevent them from being that complete support system that people of privilege have. So
absolutely. And I'd say one other thing about what Marlee just said. That's absolutely something that I have to remind myself of daily. I have a senior in college who's not at Notre Dame, a sophomore in college, a junior in high school, and a 12-year-old. And you want to talk about the pandemic influencing people, like adolescents and young adults just had their worlds turned. I mean, we all did, but they did especially. You don't get another prom. You don't get another high school or college graduation. You don't get another chance to study abroad. There's a lot of firsts and lasts in those ages. And the more that we can say, tell me what you need, and if you can't tell me what you need, I'll be here when you can, is hugely important. For those of you who are connected to Notre Dame and a particular dorm, even if you don't know the rector or the RAs in that dorm, I would really encourage you to reach out. All of their emails are on the website at studentaffairs.nd.edu. Our hall staff has worked 4 times the amount of any hall staff job ever in the history of Notre Dame, for no more money, for no more pay, and for a lot more hassle than ever in their existence. And they are tired, and they need to hear from people that we love them. So even if you don't have a kid at Notre Dame, reach out to your old dorm and be like, hey, rector, this lady told me that you needed some positive encouragement. And just say, we're really grateful for you all, because man, have they really worked their tails off this semester.
Yeah, I think the appreciation really can go a long way, and I'm sure they're all in some ways very thankful that Saturday at noon is coming. it's
They are, and we're all going to worry. We're all going to worry about everybody as they go off, and what these next 10 weeks hold for so many of us. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk with you, and everybody on this call should know, and who watches this should know, that my door is always open. My email is always there, and I'm happy to talk to anybody anytime about these things.
Well, thank you so much. Now, how can the audience learn more about the Africana Studies program?
So I think, can I share my screen?
You are a host, so.
Let's see if I can only host. I don't think I can share my screen right now, but what I will say is, and it's not a big deal, they're pretty easy. Africana.nd.edu is the Department of Africana Studies. We're pretty new. Black Studies has been around for a long time, but we've only been a department since 2005. So we're in our 15th year as a department who can hire tenured faculty. The Office of Student Enrichment, you can find at studentenrichment.nd.edu. And the Ann Bryce program, you can find at Ann Bryce, and Ann is A-N, Bryce is B-R-Y-C-E. Yep. All one word, Ann Bryce at nd.edu or .nd.edu. So yeah, Google us, look at what we're doing, and I look forward to talking to anybody anytime.
Well, thank you, Dr. McKenna. What a pleasure to have you on with us.
Right back at you.
Thanks to the audience for joining this evening. This has been another episode of Racial and Social Justice Beyond the Dome. Technical direction by Carrie Boehner and Lily Crawford. I'm Dan Yu, and this has been a production of the Notre Dame Club of Pittsburgh. You may follow us at ND Pit Club on Facebook, Twitter, ndpitclub.com, and Notre Dame Pit Club on Instagram. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good evening, and go Irish.
Take care, everybody. Good night.
All right. Thank you. I think we can stop recording.